Happy Pride Month. Don't ask where I've been. It's classified. I will say back in February, I filmed a video about the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and when I went to edit it, it was entirely out of focus. So that really broke my spirit. I couldn't even look at a camera, to be honest with you. That being said, I obviously still have that script, so if you're at all interested, feel free to let me know. Anyway, I've been empowered by the intensely gay energy of June, so hello. Of course, it comes as no surprise that I have a passionate and intense interest in Red Dead, but I also have a very keen interest in queer history, and it just so happens that those things happen to overlap sometimes. Now, Red Dead is no gold standard as far as explicit queer representation goes, make no mistake there. But there are still a few characters that I can construct a bit of a discussion around, I suppose, if I must. It's a talent, you know, pushing the gay agenda. There's the subtle gay implications where Mr. Black and Mr. White are concerned. Truly my favorite enemies to lovers arc. Or there's Charles Chardonnay. I'm not French. Anyway, he will not only steal your wife, but also maybe your husband, causing chaos and then leaving the country. Truly a bisexual menace to society. Or we have Margaret, who isn't actually a queer man, but he is a man who's participating in public cross-dressing. So slay. What I appreciate about all these characters is the way that our protagonist, or protagonists, depending on how you like to handle your side missions, respond to all these characters so casually. From being amused by the old married couple banter between Mr. Black and Mr. White, or appreciating the lack of decorum from Mr. Chatternay, or even respecting Margaret's presentation, and pronouns. Ally. They're all fun, subtly queer-coded identities and experiences, but what I really want to talk about is Bill Williamson, masculinity in the 1800s, and old-timey queer identities. So, indulge me if you will. Or don't. But if you don't, you're homophobic. That was a joke. So let's talk about Bill Williamson. We first met Bill in 2010 in Red Dead Redemption as one of the antagonists and ex-gang members of John Marston. He's pretty despicable in this game. The Williamson gang is responsible for some pretty not-so-chill things. They're and pillaging their way across the West with Bill Williamson at the helm. He's described as dumb and angry, and I would say he lives up to that description pretty aptly. Though it's not as though this game gives him a ton of nuance or substance as a character. He's simply an antagonist or an obstacle in John's way in his pursuit to his family's safe return. Red Dead Redemption 2, however, gives us a lot more time with Bill and therefore makes it easier for us to develop a deeper understanding as far as who Bill is. Through mission dialogue and camp interactions, we can see that at his core, Bill is an insecure man, and because of this insecurity, Bill is frequently seen lashing out at those around him, especially those that he perceives as being below him, people like Javier or Lenny.
You know, I don't like your attitude.
Well, okay then.
Damn right it's okay.
Get lost, Bill.
I said, what you doing, greaser?
On one hand, this facet of his character seems pretty self-explanatory. He feels inferior to those around him. But on the other hand, I'd like to explore where I think some of this inferiority is stemming from. Prior to being in the Vanderlyn gang, Bill Williamson had a career in the United States Army as a soldier until he was dishonorably discharged for deviancy and attempted murder. We never actually learned the exact story behind these charges, however. Deviancy often fell under a category of Army charges known as Section 8, which was frequently given out to those who were deemed unfit for service. This often meant mentally unfit, be it someone who is mentally unwell to the point that they would endanger themselves or their fellow servicemen, or someone who is deemed unwell by the standards of the time. The current understandings that we've constructed around LGBTQ folks is relatively new. Prior to our identity-based understandings, homosexuality specifically was less of an identity and more a behavior. It wasn't uncommon for people to participate in homosexuality and still end up in heterosexual marriages. As religious specifically Christian, evangelical, Catholic ideals had intermingled with American culture and government, some people, as many do today, would construct certain ideas around LGBTQ folks to discourage such behavior. Trans folks, cross-dressers, homosexuals would be deemed mentally unfit and subsequently discharged from fields like the army if they were caught behaving in a deviant manner. And this was a charge that queer men would often face, all the way up until the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that was enacted under the Clinton administration that would prevent the army from discharging people for their sexual orientation. Now, of course, we can't just see deviancy and immediately jump to that must mean Bill Williamson was discharged for doing something gay. I mean, attempted murder was also on that list of charges, so it's not like we can assess on this alone, but let's just add it to the evidence folder, shall we? Yes, I am building a case. Anyway, pretty early in chapter 2, Hosea throws out a little jokey joke about how couples whose names rhyme won't work out in the end, and he throws out Bill and Phil.
Well, Lenny and Jenny could never have worked. That's like Arthur and Martha, or Bill and Phil.
Now, I'm aware that Phil can be shorthand for a few feminine names like Phyllis or... that might be it. Anyway, I do think it would be silly if Phil was short for Phyllis or some other unknown feminine name that I can't think of, simply because there are other names that rhyme with Bill that are more overtly feminine, like Jill, or that might also be it. I'm not very good with names. Anyway, it's a one-off joke that isn't really worth dwelling on. Hosea isn't the only one to crack a joke about Bill's hypothetical sexuality, though. John and Charles also do.
Bill don't like nobody who's tougher or smarter than him. Ain't that right, Arthur?
Quite right. Which means he don't like many people at all. Except for maybe that Kieran.
See? You learn quick.
There's this subtle allusion to the fact that Bill might have some kind of fondness for Kieran. Now, when Bill and Kieran first meet, they obviously don't get along. And I suppose one could argue that Bill's sheer excitement at the idea of gelding Kieran could be a sign of something.
I thought you were the horse expert! What do you reckon, Morgan?
I reckon you two are made for each other.
Made for each other.
But then we'd have to raise our eyebrows at Dutch for being the one to suggest it, so I don't think I'll read too deeply into the idea that Bill is excited at being cruel. However, once chapter 3 rolls around, Bill seems to warm up to Kieran. A lot.
So, what are you... I mean, where are you... you want to have a drink?
Oh, no thank you, sir.
Have a goddamn drink! Well, have another drink.
Well, I can't right now, sir. I gotta go help with the horses. Sorry, excuse me.
With the horses? Wait a minute, come on back here! Well, come on back here, you hear? Shit!
And it's not like this is an indication that Bill, likes Kieran or anything. However, this interaction, paired with the way other camp members will poke fun at this apparent affection that Bill possibly holds for Kieran, is certainly drawing me to some conclusions. Add it to the file, I reckon. Also, at some point, Bill can ask Arthur for hair pomade despite being balding on the top of his head and almost always just looking disheveled.
Excuse me?
You know, hair pomade.
No.
Well, if you happen to find some.
Sure. I'll buy you some hair pomade.
It's not like it's Josiah Trelawney who's asked for hair pomade, leaving you wondering what exactly he's using it for. I mean, look at the man. Of course he uses hair pomade. Bill? Unlikely. What's it for, Bill? And furthermore, why is Arthur so damn weird about this interaction?
Thanks, Morgan. I owe you one.
I reckon we should both just forget this ever happened.
Like it's hair pomade. What are we being so coy for? It's especially amusing if Bill comes up to ask Arthur while you have him wearing hair pomade and he still gets all coy and strange about it. Hair pomade used to be made primarily out of animal fat until the popular petroleum jelly company, Vaseline, had cornered several markets with their brand, including hair pomade. This meant that hair pomade, both Vaseline brand and otherwise, were rather greasy. I don't know if it still is. It might be. I wouldn't know. Believe it or not, I don't actually use hair pomade. Anyway, proper lubrication products would not be invented until about 5 years after this interaction. So basically what I'm saying is hair pomade was a frequent go-to choice for lubrication needs, especially for illicit backdoor activities where a natural lubrication would not be a factor. Now, I'm not saying that Bill asked for hair pomade for such activities, but what I am saying is I don't know what he used it for. And I also don't know why Arthur was being so damn weird about it, so... And at this point you may be wondering, who even cares if Bill likes dudes? What difference does it make? And to that I say, how progressive of you. So true. Gay or straight, we're all the same. But also, it doesn't necessarily make a difference as far as Bill's character goes, as it's not like he ever has an on-screen romance or sits down and has a heart-to-heart about his personal identity and orientation. This is in part likely because we didn't really have the language to describe our attraction and identity the way we do now. I'm obviously very caught up in discussing the hypothetical orientation of a video game character, so if you're at all interested in queer history or the language that was utilized, especially in the West, I strongly recommend the video exploring the queer history of the Old West, ... Yeehaw, by Kaz Rowe, or the research paper Out West, The Queer Sexuality of the American Cowboy and His Cultural Significance by Hannah Klempnar Miller. Both of these pieces of media have been really influential in terms of giving me a jumping off point to start my research on this video, and I think they're just really good in general, so please check them out. But to make a long story short,
I put a whole bag of jelly beans up my ass.
the word gay did not exist in the same sense that it does today, and neither did our understandings of queer identities. Moreover, it's kind of scary to have that conversation. It's kind of scary to have that conversation, especially in 1899. So we're left to draw inferences on context clues. Many queer and closeted men, even in modern contexts, suffer from compulsory heterosexuality, which is the idea that heterosexuality is both enforced and assumed in our current society. Now, it's important for me that I tell you that compulsory heterosexuality, or comphet for short, was a term popularized and coined by lesbians to describe the unique experience of being socialized in heteronormative society as a gay woman. Comphet talks about the intersection between misogyny and homophobia, but due to a lack of better descriptor for the experience I'm describing right now, I will use comphet to discuss the mindset that queer men had, especially given the setting that we're discussing. But basically, we live in a society that is both patriarchal and heteronormative and makes the assumption that we will be attracted to the opposite gender, and it is often presented as the only option, whether it be through representation or societal standards that may or may not be held up in your own home. Compulsory heterosexuality is often so pervasive in people's lives that many people will go on to date, marry, and sleep with people of the opposite gender, even though they have no actual attraction to them. Oftentimes, when I discuss Bill's hypothetical sexuality on the Accursed Clock app, I will receive rebuttals about Bill claiming he slept with Abigail or his gang's unspeakable acts, which I will touch on in a moment. Anyway, many people who identify as gay or lesbian will often find themselves in heterosexual relationships before they accept or even realize that they are gay themselves. And many of them will continue to pursue those relationships even after realizing that they are not heterosexual, because either they don't accept their orientation or their community won't. We know very little about Bill's personal life or his family, other than the fact that he had a father who was an alcoholic. However, due to the fact that it's the 19th century, society alone probably enforced very rigid standards as far as masculinity goes, as well as heteronormative standards. So even if the language and understanding did exist for Bill to verbalize and articulate his own identity, it's unlikely he ever would have, because if there's one thing we do know about Bill, it's that he's pretty insecure. Bill seems to feel rather inferior to those around him, and to his benefit, it's not as though people don't make him feel that way. He's often picked on for his lack of intelligence or the tough front he puts on. The characters he does push around often seem to shrug it off or even laugh at him for it. He frequently attempts to posture with other members of the camp, and one interaction I find particularly notable as far as discussing Bill's orientation goes goes happens with Arthur Morgan. A slight trigger warning for discussions of SA, and even though I'm going to be as vague as I possibly can be, I figured it was best to let you know ahead of time. There's an NPC that I recommend avoiding that lives in the swamp, and if you're unfortunate enough to come across him as Arthur, this NPC will knock Arthur unconscious, and the implication is that Arthur is assaulted in his sleep. Later, at camp, Bill will approach Arthur to mock him for this, and I find this interesting for two reasons. It seems to be both indicative of insecurities Bill might have regarding his own orientation, as well as implicative of that very orientation. I say this because how exactly did this conversation come up between Bill and the man of the swamp? How exactly did this man get into discussing his personal sexual escapades with Bill Williamson? What exactly was it about Bill Williamson that made this man feel so comfortable that he would tell Bill that he got pretty up close and personal with another man? How is it that Bill had an exchange with this man that didn't end in him being knocked out and assaulted himself? Rather curious, if you ask me. I'm not claiming to know what happened between these two, but what I am saying is it's rather interesting that Bill walked away from that interaction unscathed and with this information about Arthur. And like I mentioned before, his immediate leap to mock Arthur for this seems rather indicative of a personal insecurity he might have regarding his own orientation. Of course, Bill could just be homophobic, which I'm sure he is, whether he's attracted to men or not, as these things are not mutually exclusive. Any of these things I've brought up could mean nothing. However, this is a written story, and if something is repeatedly being brought to the attention of the reader, or player in this instance, it's typically being done with some kind of intention. There's a reason that there's multiple happenings in this story that could lead us to the reasonable explanation that Bill Williamson might be a boy kisser. Between all the little jokes, his dynamic with Kieran, the deviancy charge, and his interaction with the swamp weirdo, it's not as though this is a conclusion that's being drawn from nothing. If it was only the silly little Bill and Phil joke or a rogue deviancy charge, yeah, it'd be kind of a reach to come to the conclusion that Bill might like men. Except it's not just one. It's quite a few instances. So what does that mean for Bill's character? As previously mentioned, it's a hallmark of Bill Williamson's character in both Red Dead 1 and 2 that he is a deeply insecure man. That insecurity does partly stem from the fact that he's clearly not as intelligent as some of the other people in the gang. However, it's not like anyone in the gang is particularly sharp, except for like Lenny. Not that they're all brick dense like our buddy Bill over here, but their intelligence is not a standout trait. I mean, as John states, Bill doesn't like anyone who's tougher and smarter than him, except for maybe that Kieran. Bill is often trying to adhere to the rigid standards set out for men in the 19th century, and that standard often meant that men were to be seen as strong and assertive and independent and so on. Bill is in a gang where he's not relied on in the same way that some of the other members are in respect to their capability and strength. Though that doesn't mean that Bill is weak and incapable. He's often sent out on important jobs, trusted with key factors of said jobs, and he contributes to the gang well enough, more so than some of the other members who are far less aggressive about asserting their dominance, or masculinity. Another part of 19th century masculinity and modern day toxic masculinity is divesting from anything perceived as feminine. This could look like men refusing to drink a cocktail because it's in a feminine appearing glass, or it's pink and sweet. And men, of course, drink much more masculine drinks, like beer or whiskey on the rocks or something. This would be a lot better with a lime. It can also look like men enforcing this rigid standard by policing one another's fashion, like mocking men for wearing painted nails. Speaking of nails, do you guys like my pride nails? If you don't, you're homophobic. In a more historical sense, this could look like a father verbally or even physically abusing their son for not adhering to rigid masculine standards for doing things like showing emotions. And also, that's not to say that that's something that only happens in a historical context. It, still does. It could also look like forcing young boys to participate in hard labor or dangerous tasks to prevent them from getting soft, or discharging a soldier from the army because they diverted from heteronormative or patriarchal standards by participating in cross-dressing or sleeping with one another. Bill's mockery of Arthur could also be a way of him adhering to this rigid standard and enforcing it onto Arthur in turn. Moreover, the intense aggression and violence that he and his gang seem to display during Red Dead 1 could also be an extension of this. To perform and prove his masculinity, he dominates regions and women as a way to feel less inferior for his own orientation. Bill seems to go so far in divesting from anything perceived as feminine that he doesn't even go by his own legal first name. He gets very frustrated and defensive when anyone seems to remind him that his name is actually Marion Williamson and not Bill. It is a unisex name, with many men and women being named Marion to this day. However, it is a diminutive of the name Marie, which is historically regarded as a feminine name. Bill goes so far as to attempt to hide this detail from people and gets very frustrated when anyone brings it up. This is likely because Bill perceives the name as feminine, and this is reinforced by the way other characters will use the name with Bill in an attempt to mock him. As mentioned before, I believe a lot of Bill's insecurity stems from a perceived inferiority. And the reason I've talked so much about the plausibility of Bill being a boy kisser is because I think this is what fuels his inferiority complex, as well as his apparent displays of toxic masculinity and later his gang's violent tirades. Bill sees his attraction to men as something that deviates from the rigid standard that he's held to as a man, and attempts to compensate for that perceived inadequacy with aggression, as well as copes with it with excessive drinking. I mean, that and also, like, alcoholism is said to be genetic, so I don't know, apples, trees, something. I'm not Bill's biggest fan, and his hypothetical orientation doesn't really change that, but it does add a degree of nuance to his apparent insecurity and aggression. It could also be in part fueling some of his alcoholism, as he's clearly inebriated often when he's reacting aggressively. He's also attempting to get Kieran to drink with him when he's presumably already drunk. He also gets pretty aggro about that, so I also want to address the way that tropes like this, the angry, violent, closeted man, are very pervasive and harmful in media. There's a long-standing trend of gay characters whose arc is filled with being violent and aggressive to those around them in an attempt to repress their own orientation. And while this is a lived experience for many, I think it's really important to remind people that gay men are far more likely to face violence than they are to enact it. The reason I'm making a bit of an exception for Bill Williamson is because, one, I like Red Dead, but also two, the context and setting in which we're discussing is far more likely to foster these kinds of violent, angry, closeted men than our current LGBTQ climate. You know what I mean? So, is Bill gay? To me, it feels pretty heavily implied, although I'm not going to sit here and claim I know what the writers intended to do when they were developing Bill Williamson. I will say that we've developed quite the case. And also, Stephen J. Palmer, the man who played Marion Williamson, did post this on his Instagram one time, so do with that what you will. Basically, I just think Bill's an interesting exploration of masculinity and queer identities in the late 19th, early 20th century and whatnot. Please don't accuse me of making Red Dead gay. I didn't do anything. Take it up with Rockstar. With that, my verdict is gay.
Be who you are for your
Anyway, I know I disappeared for a bit and pulled a bit of a John, abandoning the gang and whatnot, but I'm here. I'm back. I'm ready to be a father. Maybe. I found myself getting a little overwhelmed by the standards I had set for myself as far as producing long-form content went, and so to combat this, I just took a little bit of a break, I guess. I've also been adjusting to changes in my life outside of the internet, because yes, I do have one. I'd also like to mention that the money that I make on this video will be donated to Lama Al-Nahal and her family's GoFundMe, as they are raising money to evacuate Rafah. If you have any spare change rolling around and would like to help a family that is currently being impacted by the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, you can find that link down in my description below. So yeah, happy Pride Month, free Palestine, cheers. Anyway, that's it. Bye.